Hello everyone, welcome to the 33rd iOS tutorial. In this tutorial, we will finish what we talked in Core Data Part 1. And this is all about NS predicate, NS fetch request, and execute the fetch request, and how we can query the database. So let's move on. Here's the final app that we are going to create. I will give a name to this, and last name like G. I'm a student ID of 1. Let's give it for 1. So we add it to the database. It shows that it adds. Let's give it the same name, but this time with ID 1 more. So it added the third. Now I want to give it the same ID. So give the name maybe different name, something and something like this, but with the same ID. It fault. It didn't add it to the database. So we should check for the unique ID first to see if we should add this to the database or not. This is one functionality that we are going to implement. The other one is search. The search ability gives us this functionality to search, for example, for all of the name with this characters. So if I search, it will return all of the hashtags that I added. I cannot dismiss the keyword here, but you will see that we added this ID, and this ID, which is 1113. So that's what we are going to implement. So let's move on. For the first functionality that I showed in the demo, for not adding the same student ID to the database, we should go to our student add plus add and start from here. We should check first. This is the place that we are adding stuff into our database. First, we should check if the student ID that we have exists into the database or not. So how do we get the student ID? We have the student info dictionary here. So it's easy. We just get the student ID that user wants to input. We should say NS3 and student ID, and we call it student ID. This is the student info. Sorry, info. And the way that we get the student ID is just side of the bracket and say this is how it retrieved the student ID from this dictionary. And then we define NS fetch request. This is new. NS fetch request. Request, and we call it request, and what it does, it just create NS fetch request, fetch request with entity name. We give it our entity name. Just to remind you, this is our entity name, students. So I go back here. We call it students. And now we define a predicate. This is how we add the predicate. Predicate equals NS predicate. So don't worry if you don't get it. I will explain everything with format. And now we give it a format and student ID. Okay, just let me, I will explain all of it in a second. Equals @ %. Okay, what it does, these two lines of code, we create a request in order to search through the database. and we say that, okay, this request is fetching from this entity, and this is our student's entity, and we add a predicate. Predicate is for search query. So if we want to create a query, we use predicate. And how do we use predicate? We said, okay, predicate with format, and we say, okay, there is a student ID inside of this entity, that this student ID should be equal to the student ID that we created here. If it's equal to this, now give me all of the matches. So first we know that maybe during the fetch, maybe we get error, so we define error, and this is the array that we have here. It would be our matches, so we call it matches, and we use the context that we created here, context, and this is the time that we execute fetch request. So we say execute fetch request, and with what request? The request that we created. And if it has any error, we say and sign error. So it goes through the database, it execute the fetch, and if it has any error, it returns it. Now, what should we do with these matches? There are three cases. There would be three cases that we have to handle it. So first of all, let me see what is the, yeah, this is, it says that this variable is not used. Yeah, there are three cases. So I would differentiate these three cases. The case that we don't have any matches. The matches is nil. So if the match is nil, it's an error, of course. Or the other situation is we have error actually. So it would be another case that we have error. Or the count for matches is more than one, because we know that it should be unique. So matches for this student ID should be one, only one. So the other error could be when the matches count is more than one. So this is the place that we handle errors. Which we don't spend time here. You can just add some UI to show the user that the errors happened, and with nice UI format, but we just leave it as is. The second thing, if the matches count, and it means that it returns only one. So I would say matches count. So it's not nil, first of all, but and it's not bigger than one, greater than one. So it would be exactly one. So what would we do? We would return the first object of this array. So we said student entity, the one that we created here. We would say, okay, equals to matches first object. It has only one object, so we can say object at index 0 or say first object. So what would it do? It says it returns the existing object. So if we have this student ID in our database, it would return the object that we have. The last situation would be the time that we don't have this object. So we add all of the data that we had before inside of this else statement. We would say, okay, we don't have this student ID, so we want to create it. With what info? With student info dictionary. So okay, I added a breakpoint here, so we want to step through it and see what it does when we don't have the data and what it does when we already have the data. So I want to say, okay, the first item tag and the last name is GH, and the student ID I would say 7777. Add to the database. So it stops here. So I want to see all of the variables here. As you can see, the student info, when I step over it, the student ID that we created here, it gets the 77 from the dictionary that we created, and then it creates the request and then predicate, and then it goes to the matches, and let's see what are the matches. If I do PO matches, the array is empty. So it should go to the last statement. Let's step over it and see if it actually goes to the last step. Just a second. But it goes to the last step, and it's trying to create the ID. So it added to the database. Now let's add with the same ID again. I want to add it to the database and see what it does this time. Okay, create the student ID, error, matches. Let's do the PO matches again, and see, this time it's not nil. It has the item that we have. So it should go to this statement, this if statement, the middle one. And now it goes to the middle one, and it returns the student ID that we already have. And we got this. In order to have a search functionality, first we need to add some UI for it. So I would add a button here. I would call it search. And I would use this horrible. It's not that horrible, but for our UI, we use the constraint. Add missing constraint. So it added some bad constraint to our UI, but in order to have a proper constraint, just should watch the auto layout tutorial. Okay, so it's a UI button, and we call it search database. So we have the function right now. We can just go ahead and add the functionality for it. It's in view controller. This is the IB action that we just added. We need to have another method like this to update our UI text field. So we can add this one here, down here, and just put it equal to the new function that we're going to add into student. Here's the place that we can add our public API, and we want to add the search function here. And what it should return, it should return an NS array because it's just a result of the search. So we can store it as in an array. So I would say search student by name. And what is the name? We've just passed the name and it's a string. It's a name. So we're going to implement this function inside of the .m file. We go to the .m, and after this, I'll say this. So there's some steps that we can just copy paste from the previous because we just want to search. So the search criteria is exactly like the steps that we have here. We can just add a function in order to avoid code duplication, but just in order to have the simplicity of the application, I just copy paste it and add it here, but don't do it. You have to avoid code duplication. So what I do here, we were searching for student ID before, so this time I would say this is not a student ID, of course. We are searching for the name, so I would create a string. Instead of this, I would say it should be the name, and here I would say name equals, and we can just get rid of this. And yes, so what we basically did until now is just creating the context and creating the entity instance, create a request from this entity, and then predicate, and we are searching to see which instance has the same name that we are passing to this function. And then the next thing is to execute fetch. So we say ns array and we call it fetched object. Fetched object equals to context, and this time we execute fetch request with request, and the NS error, we didn't define the NS error, so let's define it up here. We can say not here, NS error, and we can add it here, @error. So this is the fetched object, and now we can say, we can define an NS mutable array, because we want to add stuff inside of the array, so it should be mutable. Call it results, and we have to initialize it in order to add stuff inside of the array. First we have to initialize the array init, otherwise it remains nil, which we don't want. So this is now we have to add the stuff, whatever we fetched, inside of a function and return it as this array for the user that searched. So how do we do this? We would say for, this is a for loop, but it's for each. We say for in students, whatever students, and this is the instance of student entity, student entity in, it's for in loop, and fetch objects, and inside of this we will add the results. Now we have to add objects. So how do we add objects, whatever we fetch inside of this for loop? So I want to create another function down here, and it basically gives us NS dictionary here. NS dictionary, let's say create objects from entity. In order to make this function simple, I extract this function out of it. I could add it inside of the for loop, but it would be much easier if we just separate it. So the students, so I just passed this object in order to add it. So this is exactly this, student info. And then what we do here, we create a temporary dictionary. We call it NS mutable dictionary, and we call it temp dict. And what it does, first of all, we have to allocate memory for it. So NS mutable dictionary alloc init, and then we would say this temp dict, and the name has some name. We want to retrieve a name, and equals to student info dot name. So basically we're creating a dictionary with all of the items that we have inside of the object. So last name, equals to student info dot last name, and temp dict this time student ID equals to student info dot student ID, and at the end we return temp dict. So every time inside of this for loop we add objects to this result. So I would just call this method, I would say self, since we are inside of that class. So, and then create entity, and I just patch student entity. So what it does, it goes to this for loop and it adds what object, it adds it finds the entity first, and it creates the dictionary for it, and it adds one dictionary as one object of this array, and at the end we can just return this result. This is how it returns the result. So we can just use this because it's complaining that it's not used here. We can just student entity fetch object. So if I run this, nothing would happen. First of all, we just have to go back to that controller and set this text area to the new function that we just created. It's search student by name, and we pass the first argument, which is the, and it should be a description at the end. Description, since this is the text exactly like before. So if I run it, okay, now if I add, for example, Sam as a name, G as a last name, and ID 111, add to database, it adds. And I want to say Sam2, add to database, it adds to Sam2. It doesn't add it, see, because the ID is the same, so I should change the ID. Add to database, it changed it. I say add to database Sam2 again, and another Sam with student ID 15. And now I want to search all of these Sam that I added. So I say search, and it returns all of the Sam name. So we have a different ID for them, last name. So what if I want to have a Sam as a name and G as a last name? How do we do this? In order to have this functionality, we would add the last name here inside of our function. So we should pass the last name as well. Say as a string, and the last name, name. So we have to pass it as an AND. We put AND here. This is one of the criteria that we are going to have. I would say last name equals and percent at sign and last name. So it would add this last name as this percent at sign, and it will return all of the data that has the name and last name matches with these two objects. So we have to add this to the .h file as well. So all of the other classes can see the changes. Of course, we would have some error here. Yes, we have to add the last name, and for the last name we add this field. So this time if I run the program, it should search for both the name and the last name. Okay, now if I say Sam, G, and some ID, add it to database, and with different ID, add it to database. If I search, it should return these two Sam because it searched for the first name Sam, last name G. So we have two items, which is first name Sam, last name G. So one important part that I missed is when we add the stuff into the database, we should save them. So these, first of all, we know that during the saving we might have some errors, so we better handle the errors. And we save to the database by say context save. This is the function. And I put it inside of the if statement that if we get any error, it will log to the console that we have some error and it says couldn't save with this description. So it is very important. It was maybe part of the previous tutorial that I missed, but we should add it to after we created the object and we want to save it. That's all for this tutorial. There are tons of things about core data and the things about NS predicate, and we have or, and, contains, and all of this stuff that you can query the database, and greater than, equal than, and all of these number related conditions. So you can dig into it and based on your needs and customize it. But it's just the basic that you can start. Until next time.